Hi there guys, welcome back to this channel. My name is Tamara and I'm a psychologist here in South Africa. Thank you so much to all of you for all your questions and comments based on the previous video with Lodro Rinsler, who co-authored How to Love Yourself and Sometimes Other People. Based on so many questions, it was so interesting to read what you guys had taken from that and what you wanted to discuss a bit further or get some further enlightenment on, was the notion on basic goodness. So basic goodness within human beings. Are we basically good? Is there potential for us to be bad? It's such a deep and philosophical question that I'll try to open up with some psychological theory. But remember, with philosophical debate, there's a whole bunch of to and fro with this question depending on the viewpoint and the theory. So, for example, there is the medical model that if we look at psychopathy or sociopathy, in brain development, if you don't have the areas of the brain that are created for or developed enough for the centers of remorse to happen, then obviously that will temper with that question of goodness. If you can cause harm to another and not experience much remorse, then you'll have that medical model. As well as to understand that we all have good and bad within us, and it's how we develop, how we interact with those two sections that philosophical schools of thought can question that from that assumption. For today's analysis, it will be looking at it from a humanistic psychology approach. With the humanistic psychology approach, human beings are all seen as basically good. So what that means is that we are all born with goodness within us. So when we're born with goodness, that means that we're pure, that we're working towards our highest potential. So we're born to strive towards that goodness. And a term of self-actualization comes up towards trying to find one's own potential. When we are working towards that own potential, what happens within this human psychological movement is we can have deviations from that goodness that comes in the way. And those deviations are what hinder you towards working towards that self-actualization. Being self-actualized is a continuum. It's something that you never fully reach. We are always growing, we're always evolving. So sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, do psychologists go to psychologists or supervision? And absolutely they should. And they do go, because we're human beings and everyone should be continuously asking themselves how they should be better and where they can look at their own blind spots and how to grow. Everybody on the planet is growing all the time in their sense of consciousness. So in terms of this model of self-actualization, we never fully reach it. We never fully get to that point where you'll see that you can abstain from all bad temptations or bad things or not do anything bad because you are a human being. But self-actualizing and working towards self-actualization from the humanistic approach looks at in many different ways that you're trying to go to that basic sense of self that you're born with towards helping yourself and helping other people. Through that, if we look at the existential movement underneath the humanistic psychological school of thought, the existentialists believe that we all have free will. Now, this can be both a conundrum and a liberating statement, because when you have free will, you have that liberating feeling. So you can choose to do whatever you want to do, but then you have the responsibility of that choice, that whatever you choose to do comes with some type of consequence. So in that, if you look at the humanistic movement, you are always in the driver's seat. So things that happen to you, you can within time grasp that basic goodness, look at the barriers that you've either created around yourself or that life has presented to you, and then navigate that trajectory towards understanding that whole framework to get towards the basic goodness and towards your basic goals. What is really empowering about this approach is that if one assumes that we are all basically good and we have goodness within us, and all we have are all these blockages and barriers that we either create in our own lives, for example, self-sabotage, low self-esteem, or perpetuating bad cycles of behavior within generations of families, is that you have the power to first analyze that and do something about it. So slowly removing those obstacles to be able to move towards self-actualizing your potential. So knowing that you are in the driver's seat can be extremely empowering and also daunting, because then you realize that in some way or another, no one is going to come in and do it for you. It is up to you. The big thing here is to understand that, and it should liberate you and make you feel more empowered, is that if you are born under the assumptions, if you assume that you are basically good, then your journey on this planet is to go back to that goodness. So it's almost working backwards. From the barriers and the blockages, you're going to analyze what are the prison cells or doors or locks that I'm creating or have been created around me, or that I am perceiving. Perception is very powerful. How can I remove them? How can I remove them in a way that it will allow me to come to fruition? So it's almost like releasing the inner, free, liberated self, the one that is self-actualized and towards its highest potential, where you're working from an inward and a contribution to society that will matter to you, meaning making to you. So how liberating is that, to think that we're basically good? All human beings are basically good, and everything else that we do is deviations from that basic good self, the self that has been born with innate goodness, an innate sense of inner responsibility to self and to the society at large or group context. And our job is to analyze what's going on that's deviating from that goodness. Some of these things that could be deviating are things like psychological or socio-cultural reasons. So perhaps abuse or neglect in the household, deaths in the family, like in the parental structure, not enough resources available towards infancy and the developmental structure. Something that's really interesting to understand is the power of epigenetics, or looking at our environment and how it shapes the brain and the mind. Is that the more we understand how the environment shapes the brain and the mind and well-being of the self, the more we can return and buffer that and recreate a new environmental stimulus for the brain and mind for it to be able to thrive. When you do that and when you realize the power of that, you won't necessarily sit in a victimized or helpless state as per usual, when you realize that you do have power. As many people may say, I came from a terrible background, or I came from an oppressive family system, or I could never break out of my cultural system. I could never do these things. No one's ever done it before. But what is stopping you? Yes, there are major things in places. For example, if you break tradition, you could stand the chance of losing your standing in that family, or the culture, or the religious standard. There's so many things that could happen. But we have to ask oneself, is the prison cells, which sometimes is a familial, societal, religious context, could be all of those things, even schooling, are these things one of the prison cells that's keeping me locked in place, that I can't let this inner self free, I can't let this person out of who I'm supposed to be? So it's almost like, from a humanistic psychological approach, it's unlearning conditioning and going back to the core. So it's unlearning, trying to see what was imprinted or conditioned in us, what was expected, and going back to who you were as a child, that inner, pure, good self. Those are all the amazing things that you can do through an analytical lens to see. And you will know, your gut and your nervous system will tell you, I just don't feel myself like this. I feel like I'm trying to put on a brave face, or I'm trying to be something I'm not, because it's the only way I'm going to fit in. And you have to ask yourself, are you truly your self-actualized self, or the most authentic person you could be? It is a process of becoming and being. So remember, becoming is a process, but being is enjoying the process, is being one with the process, is going one step at a time, learning to like yourself, despite what society at large or your family system, whatever it is that you come from, is telling you. Because remember, we all condition generation to generation to generation, and we can always challenge oneself and the societies and communities at large around us to see, is this a way that we could do this to enforce a sense of belonging in other people, or to also promote fitting in, where we have to abandon a sense of self? So I hope this was helpful in thinking about self-actualization, working towards it, and basic goodness. A basic premise or summary of this whole video for this content is that we're born basically good, and it's our journey to go back to that basic good self by removing all these blockages that are created or we create within ourselves.